Are congressional term limits unconstitutional?
That's a good question. They have been ruled unconstitutional. And just to give you a little background on that, there have been a number of states who have passed through a citizens' referendum term limits for their governor, their state legislators, and for their congressmen and U.S. senators. And the courts have pushed back on that last part, that you can't impose term limits on your U.S. congressmen and senators because that's not in the Constitution. And so in order to ever have term limits, that would require an amendment to the Constitution in order to create term limits on Congress.
Would a constitutional amendment calling for congressional term limits, would that be a bad idea then?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like the Founding Fathers did on this one. Remember that they had term limits under the Articles of Confederation. And when they went to draft this new Constitution, they recognized that that was a mistake, having term limits on Congress. And some of the reasoning they gave was that when you have term limits, say for example, I'm your US congressman, I'm now entering my final term. I have no possibility of being reelected anymore. I have nothing I need from you anymore. There's nothing you can do. I don't need your vote anymore because you can't vote for me. What this does, in their words, is it takes away the inducement to good behavior because I have no longer any reason to listen to my constituents because I can't be reelected. So who does have my ear now? Who is going to influence a congressman who has no need to listen to his constituents? Who's still there? The lobbyists, special interest groups. They have a much more influence on the congressman when they're term limited. This is very similar to the problem we have now with lame ducks. We have the lame duck session of Congress after the November election where a good portion of them that have been kicked out of office are still there.
But only for like 2 months.
Yeah,
so
month
with
or
term
two.
limits, you'd be extending that
Right.
for 2 years or 6 years, depending what branch of Congress that they're in.
Exactly. So I often point to term limits as effectively just saying, let's take this lame duck session and expand it. Make it a 2-year lame duck session rather than a 1 to 2 month session, or like you're saying for the Senate, 6 years. Of course, we all know that during the lame duck session, that's the best time to get the bad bills through, the ones that are not politically popular, the people generally oppose it. This is
The ones that the lobbyists are pushing
Right,
for.
right. That's when they want to push them. Let's wait till after the November election, then we'll be a lot more free to go against the will of the people and push through what the lobbyists
So
want.
a constitutional amendment calling for congressional term limits would be the biggest candy prize, if you will, for the lobbyists and the bureaucracy, essentially.
Absolutely, absolutely. This means lame duck session is no longer just from November to the end of the year, it's year-round.
So rather than empowering the people, the ones who think that congressional term limits would be a good thing, rather than empowering them, it actually is removing their power and transferring it to an unelected group of individuals that are lurking in the shadows of Congress and so forth.
Right. In fact, John Adams referred to term limits as a way that the people voluntarily shackle their own choice. Why would we want to shackle our choice? People always point to term limits as this is the way we can rein them in. But it's actually only limiting us, the people. We no longer have the choice to vote for whomever we desire.
I mean, I get why term limits is popular. I mean, on face value, it sounds like a good idea. Get rid of the bad
guys,
ones.
Let's rein them in.
Yeah. But when you just think about it just a little bit, you just extend the lines of the logic of term limits just a little out. I think you realize that it's a greater threat to have the term limits than it is to have, like, Barbara Boxer reelected in California.
Right. One of the things that term limits is appealing to is that in general, Congress doesn't have a very high approval rating. And I want Barbara Boxer's district to no longer be able to reelect her. Do they want that? No, they keep reelecting her.
Exactly.
And this is a way of me trying to impose my will on other districts that I'm not voting in. And so if you were to take a different survey, not just a general congressional approval survey, which is very low, but instead, what's the approval rating of your congressional district for your congressman? It's going to be a lot higher than Congress's in general. We all feel like ours is bringing home the bacon and doing a good job. For our states, we're going to keep reelecting them. Otherwise, we don't reelect them. But on the other hand, everybody else's congressman is part of the problem.
Well, take for instance, in the state of New York, my former home state. I live in Wisconsin now, but back when I lived in New York, I had the pleasure of having Hillary Clinton as my U.S. Senator. Now, she was never term limited out. She left the Senate to eventually become Secretary of State for President Obama.
Sure.
But when she was in the U.S. Senate, one could argue we need term limits to get rid of Hillary Clinton from the Senate. Well, she voluntarily left the Senate. But who was she replaced by? The voters of New York elected Senator Gillibrand. And I would imagine that most of the Tea Party movement would say that Senator Gillibrand is not a step up or a step in the right direction. Her voting record is virtually identical to that of...
So we put a new face on the same voting.
Exactly the point. So you're arguing essentially that if we have congressional term limits, we're just basically rotating faces, but we're still getting the same type of voting pattern, essentially.
Right. You know, I would quote, one of my favorite quotes on this topic comes from President James Garfield. He says, "Now more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If they be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it's because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. If we keep re-electing these corrupt congressmen, it's because the people don't mind that much that their own congressman is doing these things."
So essentially the problem is not necessarily Maxine Waters herself or a Nancy Pelosi herself, but rather the lack of education or understanding within the electorate in those districts that keep putting her in office.
Right.
So if
It's that they tolerate that type of a congresswoman or congressman, yes.
So term limits on Maxine Waters, Pelosi, or you name whomever you wish, you're not going to change that behavior within the electorate.
Without changing the mindset of the people, you just change the faces of the same policy.